So I'm happy to welcome to our panel Kyle Reutner, who is the general manager for Kohana Distillers. In 2012, he was recognized as one of the 10 mixologists to watch by Beverage Media, and he has had his drinks featured in Travel and Leisure and Food and Wine magazine. And also Taylor Kellerman, who is the Director of Diversified Agriculture and Land Stewardship for Kualoa Ranch, with responsibilities including livestock, aquaculture, farming, conservation, landscape, and education. So let me start with your backgrounds, because I think this illustrates the transition in Hawaii agriculture. Taylor, you began your career during the waning days of Hawaii's pineapple industry at Del Monte and the Maui Pineapple Company. How does what you're doing at Kualoa differ?
With the plantation, it was something that was, like you had mentioned, I was at the very end of what was kind of this great economic engine for the state in the beginning of the century. And I think that when we worked there, you could see the remnants of it, but it was clearly a ship that was starting to sail. What we have kind of seen is a transition from that larger kind of singular small amount of companies that are dominating the economy, as well as a lot of the factors, including import and export. And I think that what we've kind of learned from that as an industry perspective is the big guys were very helpful. And I think that the seed industry played that role for a little while. And now at Kualoa Ranch, we're trying our best to be participating in that food security that I think everybody desires. But we're finding that without these bigger players that used to be around, cost of goods, labor resources, as well as infrastructure in regards to utilities is more difficult when it's a lot of small things as opposed to something that has both small and large.
Could you talk a little too about the cultural importance of what you're doing there?
Yeah, I think that, if you think back to the plantation era, that kind of, it really made us who we are today in regards to diversity, both as ethnicity, food, everything, that type of thing. And I think that at Kualoa Ranch, it's interesting because we're now doing our agriculture and our other businesses in an area that hasn't seen that plantation agriculture in over 100 years. And so from a cultural perspective, it's really important that we're recognizing what we're coming from, but at the same time, I think that something we look at heavily at Kualoa Ranch is the ability to incorporate culture from a historical perspective, but also help use those values to guide us in what we're doing today, particularly from an environmental perspective.
Kyle, you come to agriculture from a very different background. I mean, you come from a food, beverage, hospitality background. What brought you to agriculture, and what was the philosophy behind working for a vertically integrated business in an industry that as I understand it, is dominated by just a few large producers like Bacardi?
Yeah.
How do you compete against Bacardi? Or you don't exactly?
Anybody have lots of access to capital? Yeah, I came to distillation and farming through hospitality, and before that chemistry. So sort of built the job from two different angles. And for us, it was just a moment of opportunity and trying to do something actually of a place. So when you think of the world of spirits, wine, beer, etc., most of it is dominated by very few players, multinational companies. However, there's an uptick in opportunities for people to take local agriculture and really buoy yourself up on something like that. So it's a very French thing. It's interesting that it doesn't get copied a lot of other places, but the French are quite good at it.
So I want to turn now to the products themselves, and I want to focus on three of them: grass-fed beef, rum, of course, and chocolate, which sounds like a very decadent meal. So let me start with you, Taylor, and grass-fed beef. Could you just walk us through how you raise the cattle without traditional intensive feedlot farming, which, as I understand, is the traditional way on the mainland, and just explain the production process.
Sure. So we at Kulo Ranch, we're not one of the larger ranches, as you know, in the state. However, we try to be consistent both in our product line pipeline as well as quality. The interesting thing about grass-fed, grass-finished beef, I kind of make that joke because we always get asked, is your cattle grass-fed? And I always, well, all cattle eats grass at some point. So it's what it's finished on that makes it differentiated. What's interesting is that in Hawaii, we are able to grow grass year-round, unlike in mainland states. However, our tropical grasses aren't as high in protein as those overwintering forages. So what takes 18 months with a mainland grass intake and then a feedlot finishing for a 15,000-pound animal takes us about 28 months to get to about 1,200 pounds. So when you're thinking about how we're doing these grass-finished programs, you have to kind of factor in not only your cow-calf operation that's producing your seed or your input, but then also your yearling pasturing as well as your finishing pasturing. What's interesting about grass-fed also is that it's something that does have a market value because it is desirable and you can differentiate yourself in sales. However, the cost is obviously much more. I think that one of the leading factors that a lot of people don't, consider is we get asked all the time, as an industry, you should be keeping more cattle in Hawaii. We should be producing more of our own beef, and I couldn't agree more. But when you consider that finishing cattle requires a forage setup that is kind of that top 25% of the forages you'll find. Whereas a cow-calf operation, you can actually have on land that is less high quality. The other thing is that most ranchers who are set up for a cow-calf operation have their income set up around a return after 8 months. You're now asking them to wait 28 months and use a much, much lower stocking density. Value higher in final sales, but it's kind of like how it evens out. So for us, we found we have a value collectively with all the other products we produce by doing grass-fed beef. And for us, it's important to have a pipeline rather than just large harvests. And that's true for all our products. So we harvest about 12 animals a month, which evens out to about 6 animals every 2 weeks.
And is one of the problems, I mean, the way, as I understand it, one of the problems also is the availability of slaughterhouse facilities in the state. Is that a cost problem for your operation?
It's certainly a bottleneck. I think that that has gotten the most airplay as far as media lately. However, there are multiple challenges. Really, the one thing I would speak to about processing is that, if you're going to finish an animal here in state and you're going to send it to your harvest plant, for instance, I send it to Hawaii Meats for harvest, which is the politically correct way to say it in 2022. But then those animals
say harvest. That's harvest, the word. Okay,
yeah.
We'll remember.
Not a slaughterhouse. It's a harvest facility. But once those animals are harvested, we then take them to Wong's Meat Market so that they can be cut and wrapped. And that's the only way that I'm able to sell to a retail market. So I now have 2 overheads in my P&L that are eating into my overhead profit. And I'm required to do that because I need a Department of Agriculture stamp to be able to sell retail.
All right, so we'll transition now to rum after we've had our grass-fed beef, and Kyle, I'll ask the same question to you. So from growing the sugar to the time the rum goes into a Mai Tai, could you explain the process and also walk us through, one of the unique things about Kahana rum, which is that my understanding is it's extremely rare, almost unheard of for a rum producer to grow their own sugarcane, to be actively involved in agriculture.
Yeah, so to that end, just let me give you a little background on what it is we do. We're a grass-to-glass rum distillery, which puts us in about the 0.1% of rum distilleries in the world. We do 3 things to differentiate ourselves, and we do this because we didn't want to compete in a commodity market. You guys know about commodity markets more than I do, but sugar didn't work right. I don't want to be well rum because that's a different style of market. So I'm looking for value add. We say it all the time, but really what you're looking for is differentiation points. You're looking for sales points that actually are going to resonate with your guests or eventual end consumer, right? So we grow our own. Why is that important? Because we control quality and we control timeline. So that's fantastic, right? I don't worry about getting stuff shipped in because we do it ourselves for that side. It also gives us the differentiation point of saying we grow heirloom Hawaiian sugarcane versus anything else. We've already got a space that we can start to make up some of the difference by that we have to pay being 3,000 miles away from our consumers. Then we're going to take that cane, we're going to harvest it, actually harvest it. I guess we cut it too, so it's fair. So we'll cut the cane, crush it, and use that juice as our fermentable, and that's the second differentiation point. Most everybody uses molasses, a byproduct of another market, to make their rum. You don't hear about that in any other spirits. You don't talk to whiskey makers and they use high fructose corn syrup, or tequila producers and they use agave syrup. But the rum world is this dirty little secret where you take your waste product and turn that into treasure. It's a brilliant entrepreneurial move, something that was really built in Barbados. We skip that, so we use this fresh product to do it. And then lastly, we distill everything and bottle it ourselves.
And I asked this question earlier to Kyle about the cultural importance of agriculture, but you're doing something very culturally important too. You're growing not just normal sugarcane.
Indeed, yeah. So think about the way the sugar story gets told the world over. It started in Papua New Guinea, India, or China, and it traveled across to the Middle East, eventually gets to kings and queens in England around some 1300, something like that, hops on Columbus's second voyage, gets to Hispaniola, comes across the US, gets to Hawaii around 1820, right? Hawaiians had sugarcane here while Europe was in the Dark Ages. So these plants belong here and they are set apart. All of the ethnodiversity you see in the Caribbean nowadays is because of Polynesian plants. These plants are amazing and really, really cool. So that's another differentiation point there.
All right, well, we'll finish our meal off with chocolate. So could you do the same thing again, Taylor, and talk to us a little about chocolate? And I understand you guys produce about 50,000 bars a year. Is that right?
We do. So we have a little under 1,500 cacao trees on site. And chocolate is very much similar to what Kyle very eloquently kind of described in regards to differentiation. For us, cacao trees obviously produce cacao pods, which is the raw ingredient for chocolate. We do our own fermentation on site as well as drying, but then we take that raw commodity or raw product to our friends at Manoa Chocolate in Kailua. They produce our bars for us under a white label, which is a really neat system because Dylan and Tamara Butterbaugh have 10, 15 years of craft mastership and a very expensive capital equipment that for us to try to repeat that product would be subpar. And quite frankly, we try to do a lot of things instead of really master one. By doing that agreement where we give them our raw ingredient, they give us back a bar for a per bar fee. They're able to support their craft and their business, and we're able to then have a product we put our own label on and sell as our own single origin chocolate. To kind of add to what Kyle said as well, chocolate is one of the emerging things in Hawaii that we can have differentiation to. Because when you're looking at the cost of doing business in Hawaii in agriculture, there aren't a lot of things that you can do cheaper in Hawaii, particularly with global economy, refrigeration, transportation being so good. So you have to find those things that you can't do anywhere else. Kohana Rum has this story, their entire business model works off that concept. And where chocolate can kind of come into play is that we have these regional areas that are now starting to win Cacao of Excellence Awards. They're now starting to be recognized. And so there's been a thought process, can we take some of these growing regions like Hamakua, east side of Oahu, different areas in Kauai, and turn them into almost wine regions so that you can then compete with all of these mass-produced areas because you have a quality that is similar to, say, a Kona coffee or a Maui onion.
That's exactly it. It's how can everybody get behind coffee or rum or the next exportable good the way that it happened with Kona, right? That's what we have to build.
Let me ask you a little bit about your business models now that we're going there, and I'll start with you, Kyle. How do you make a small distillery work in Hawaii when you're competing against these international brands? And maybe talk a little bit about, the supply side, but also ways you've diversified your income when you started out.
Yeah, so in the beginning, the goal was, well, first of all, we were well capitalized. So we had time, we had distance, and we had patient wives. Or
How long did it take from the time you started to when you produced your first bottle?
that wasn't as long as you'd think. I'd say from the first stock to the first bottle sold in our store was 6 years. We sold to bars 2 years earlier than that, so 4 years, which is a long time, right? You got to think we grew from 100 cuttings of to now we're at about 300 acres, so it's a significant jump. The advantages we had were hand-to-hand sales. So we were able to go in and talk, whereas maybe, a big brand like Bacardi might have somebody in town for a week a year. I'm, sending kids to school at the same places as these people that are buying and having all that. So we used a lot of our local connections to really do it. With that only takes you so far, right? Hawaii is 1 million people. I'm trying to be an exportable brand to 50 states, so we've had to change that over time.
Now, when I was talking to you prior to this panel, you also mentioned the role of agritourism as sort of the secret sauce in making this work. How did you make that work in the early days?
Yeah, so agritourism is great, but the real word I would use is, your words I would use is direct to consumer. Any space that you can eliminate, there was a slide up there earlier with like 17 people after the farmer, that all get paid and paid well, and the US government makes us do that too. Via a 3-tier system, but anywhere that you can shorten all of those distances and keep that money for yourself, that's where it's at, right? So we built out a tasting room. We self-distributed for years. We tried to do all of the work that most other people can just outsource ourselves, so that we could keep the dough.
And as you expand, what is the goal? Is it to remain a smaller, experience-based company, or to expand into a medium-sized rum producer?
Hawaii should be about 5% of our sales in the next 3 or 4 years. We are going to be a major export player.
And what has been the pitch you've used, to mainland buyers?
It's beautiful. We're riding the wave of people giving a crap about Providence. So we're lucky. Hawaii has a cachet, and we are so legitimately steeped in the culture here and what we do, that when you go elsewhere, people resonate with it.
So, Taylor, let me ask the same question to you. You're in a very different business here, but talk a little bit about the business model. I know there are multiple income streams to make Kualoa Ranch work, and agritourism is part of that. But since you're in the farm business too, and because Matt was just talking about technology, have there been ways that you've been able to use technology to lower your costs? Because I would imagine labor is a huge part of those costs.
Honestly, not really. Where we have found a sweet spot is not necessarily the advancement of technology in our agrarian operations. However, I do want to point out that is a very important component in food production. For Kualoa Ranch ourselves, where we found the sweet spot is basically that we have a recognizable brand, thankful to, or because of Hollywood and Dwayne Johnson and Chris Pratt. No, but I think the reality is, and I was just speaking to a group about this recently, which is, we are a for-profit business whose design is intended to create 3 things. One is to perpetuate the asset of the property that we have. 2 is to create local food. 3 is to create jobs for community. And so we try to resonate with people as a sustainable version of that, because as Matthew pointed out very well, agriculture is a razor-thin margin. And quite frankly, economically, it's a tough gig. And so what we try to do is we try to look at our process of doing business as a land management plan. That land management plan has 3 pillars. There's the economic driver, which is our agritourism, our tours, our events, movies, things like that. Our food production is the second pillar. And what we're doing is we're utilizing the assets that are existing on the property, our ranch land, our farmland, our aquaculture. Thirdly is the sense of community, and we hire primarily in our geographic area, which is a lower income area. So we're able to, I think we're about 360 employees now. And so I think that for us, a big part of it is, if I can kind of make an argument, is I don't think anybody expects, we don't expect anybody to go out and get Hollywood to come at your back door, but really it's just the sell in that's important. And I think that if you can look at agriculture as part of an effective land management plan, particularly if you can associate it with an efficient economic engine, then things like food security can be an option in a conversation. I think the thing about food security, and I'm going a little soapboxy, I apologize, but the thing about food security that came out of COVID was fantastic, because I think our community all of a sudden, with the food hubs, like you pointed out, went, oh my gosh, this is an issue. But I think what we need to look at as a community is, you can't just point at the farmers and say, okay, produce more. It's a tough business. So you have to look at it, creative ways to make either the cost of business go down or the income to go up. And diversification is a great way to do that. And that's the kind of thing that I try to push in regards to legislatures and our friends. Like, no, I'm kidding.
Matthew, actually, could I ask you this question? So a two-part question. Is this a common experience for farmers trying to diversify their source of income away from just kind of classic food truck agriculture? And then has there been a problem in Hawaii kind of embracing technology or mechanized approaches to lower costs?
Well, regards to your first question, it's been a challenge. Especially when it comes to utilization of technology, because we come from a very different background compared to other states on the mainland, because we had a plantation background. During the plantation era, all the technical expertise were within the plantation. And then we have all those workers. Our extension programs are not as efficient as the mainland, because on the mainland, usually the farmers, they go to college to get the training and expertise from the land-grant universities and colleges. And then when they go back to their farms, they rely on the extension folks for continuing education to get the expertise and technical know-how. We don't have that here. So our extension service are actually challenged by that. Additionally, I guess, there are a lot of immigrant workers that are in agriculture. There's also the additional language barrier. So the acquisition of technology is not as efficient as could be. So these folks do work very hard, but they need help to gain more expertise to enhance production. During COVID, we know that the farming industry has been mentally challenged as well. The farmers, we had this survey of farmers to assess the level of stress and anxiety, and there has been a lot. The most stressed farmers across the state are actually here on Oahu. That's a lot of issues, and they are very stressed and challenged. There's the other issue of our aging population among the farmers. Who's going to acquire the next, or the next generation who is going to take over the businesses? That's a big challenge, because my own PCP comes from a farming background, but he and his brother are physicians. They still go back to the weekend to help their parents with the farming kahuku. But I don't think they're going to take over the farm. So that's a major problem that we face. I guess our ag survey says that we don't have enough capital And I guess that's always been a challenge, right? We have to seek out new ways to get more capital flowing into the state. Sometimes, there's some resistance because I guess the business culture in Hawaii is like we want to go local first and then seek a solution elsewhere. Until we exhausted those local options, we're not going to go elsewhere.
Kyle, let me ask you about your labor costs, or I mean, what are the major costs that you face when you produce rum, and what part of that is just harvesting the cane?
Yes, so about 1/3 of our labor cost is farming and harvesting, which our labor cost is by far the biggest thing, and that's from a pretty energy intensive, and I mean we've got very expensive bottles and all. None of it matters except for labor. That's where it's all at. So it's a huge cost for us, and the thing I don't think that gets talked about a lot is building out the infrastructure of these farms. Everybody thinks it's really cool to have 1 acre and 5 acre farms, but we need larger farms to produce for real people to be able to go buy it. And that it just doesn't, there's nothing in between the small and the very large. So that's like where we're missing. And that's been our biggest thing is there's a lot of infrastructure build out and a lot of paying for labor for years before you'll ever get a return on the land or that stuff.
So what would help? And maybe let me just start by asking about state policy. I mean, Taylor, let me start with you. If you could wave your magic wand, I mean, what policies would you like to see the state implement to help Kualoa Ranch, or even more broadly, I mean, your colleagues in agriculture, what would work?
You know, I would start by, it's an interesting question because it's a broad stroked question and a good question. However, it really depends on what your goal is. And I think that I say that because I hear a few things thrown around. We talked about food security. I would say that's one goal. We talked about economic diversification. I would say that's another goal. Now, don't get me wrong, they're completely related, but they're completely different. And I think that when you look at food security, it comes down to if that is really something we desire as a community, then we need to look at it as a community. And there needs to be some cost sharing with auxiliary industries. We all eat, so it should be kind of something that we can look at collectively. If you're looking at diversification of economy, then you really need to start looking at what are these really high factors that are eating away at farmers and ranchers' bottom line. Because the reality is labor being one of them. You talked about technology, and to Kyle's point, so much technology is in farm equipment. Farm equipment technology is only usable if you have medium to large scale farms with contiguous acreage. That's not necessarily where we're headed. We're headed into a lot of little small farms, which is great on Instagram, but not necessarily in the market. So I think when it comes to legislatively, it's such a hard question. And I think that when people ask me about the ag budget, correct me if I'm wrong, 0.7% of the ag?
Close to 2.5 now.
2.5.
5.5.
0.5% of the state annual budget goes to agriculture. And I don't think the easy button is to say increase that. I don't believe that. I think that the easy button is to increase it for a reason. And that reason is because legislators follow economic particulars that their constituents care about. If very little money is assigned to agriculture, then they really don't have a reason to really dig down and dig deep and look at how certain legislation either overburdens us or creates doors for us to do better.
I know there's been a lot of talk about institutional purchases of local agriculture, and I think that there's a plan to by 2030 have the DOE purchase 30% of the food served in public schools from local producers. Is that something that you think is a priority? Would that help?
That's huge, because if you think about it, it's huge, but it's big because if you think about it, everybody knows the state's the biggest buyer. And if the state has a requirement legislatively to look local first and to pay price points that is going to support that business, then you've got something that's what we call a productive subsidy. You're going to spend that money anyways. So you are, in a way, subsidizing the industry, however, in a way that's useful to both ends. I think the challenge is again, the size of farm, food safety, all of that type of thing, because for institutional buyers like the DOE to buy from local producers, you can't expect them to be going 10 pounds here, 20 pounds here, so there's an aggregation requirement. With that, you're feeding your kids, there's a food safety requirement. With both of those things, there is a requirement for capital infrastructure. And so they're all kind of mixed together. And so I think that's kind of what I mean by, if we're gonna look at it collectively as a community, when I mean community, I don't mean mom, dad, uncle, sister, I mean as a financial business community, and each of us takes our fair share of the cost, I think it's doable. But that requires a lot of coordination, and I'm not sure we're set up for that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the same question, Kyle, and you're probably not going to be selling rum to schools. So what can the state do for you?
Well, so speaking to the export side of things, we can lose all of our margin to the shipping companies like that on either way. So I'm trying to create local jobs. So let's just take one portion of my business, right? I have 4 different businesses really at the distillery, but let's take one part of it, and that's just the bottling. I have to buy glass because we don't make glass here. I have to ship it in. I then pay my people to fill that, label it, and then ship it away. So now I've shipped glass 2 ocean trips across. That's terrible for the environment and frankly terrible for my bottom line. So now I have every reason to bottle on the mainland, right? Which pushes jobs and other things off. If we can find ways to reward value-add producers for doing work here by helping push some of the shipping things, and we don't have to go down the Jones Act stuff, but we can push some of those costs in a different direction, I think we can actually build some of these things, whether it's chocolate or macadamia nut pesto, because I hear basil's awesome now, or whatever it may be. That's huge for us. And on the other side, having made sanitizer for the state during the pandemic, we had a really unique vantage point to see the grant, contract, sales system work. And I'm now a firm believer in, give us contracts, a guaranteed buyer, I can go find capital with that, and then you can spend your money on me. Instead of sort of reversing that wheel. I'm not anti-grants, I just think they could be used a little differently.
So we only have about 15 minutes left, and I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but just maybe in 30 seconds, could all 3 of you tell the audience, what they could do to help Hawaii agriculture? I'll start with you, Matthew.
Well, I guess coming from an agency standpoint, you can always talk to your legislators, and you also need to talk to our state top officials, like the governor down, because our budget has been raised up to like 0.5% of total state budget this year. Very fortunate, up from 0.35. But we also have a 10% restriction. So it's still a challenging thing. We try and offset that by going after federal grants, but that imposes other constraints on our operations.
Taylor?
I have to assume everybody here has a network, and I think that the original thing was buy local. That's awesome. Please continue to do that. However, I think rather in addition to that, making local agriculture important, whatever reason you find it important, is key. And then trying to find areas within your own circles where that can be helped. And what I mean by that is financial institutions, land managers, legislators. So much of the legislation we've had lately is actually restricting our ability rather than increasing our ability. And oftentimes it's a secondary unintended consequence, particularly around trying to control another problem, but all of a sudden it restricts us, particularly on Oahu. So I think it's kind of being conscious of what it would take to help farmers and ranchers and producers have a better bottom line, because that really is what it comes down to.
Kyle?
Yeah, that's really good. I'll ditto. I think what I'd like to see from people is a little bit of protection of local agriculture, not of like the land or that, but the idea of it. And I think sometimes it gets thrown around in a way that is disingenuous and ends up chipping away at it. So it's good to know your farmers. It's good to know where things are coming from. So like made in Hawaii should matter. Let's keep pushing for that to actually be true.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to turn to questions now, and so please feel free to come up. And as that's happening, I want to make sure I thank the panel 3 sponsors, Kamehameha Schools and Hawaii Pacific Health. So questions, we have little over 10 minutes. Feel free to come to the microphone.
I have a theoretical question actually for the Department of Agriculture. So every legislature session, we have always talking about the food safety. We imported about more than 80% of our food from outside Hawaii. So with the limited agricultural land we have, and if we have a maximum production, how much food can we provide for Hawaii? How many, more than 20%, or how many we can feed the Hawaii people? Thank you.
Thank you. Did a study about 12 years ago, and we came up with an estimate that we import about 90% of our food, excluding beverages, sorry. They could be higher. The Department of Agriculture for the state can only do so much because we have big burdens above us. When you talk about food safety, FSMA, the so-called Food Safety and Modernization Act, that act has strict standards for the production of food items. The interesting part of it is that FSMA is not even under the jurisdiction of USDA, but it is under the jurisdiction of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So we have to comply with all those rules. For a long time, the federal government makes sure that the products that we export to the mainland are safe. I have this term that I use, FNN. Produce from Hawaii going to the mainland must be treated, 1, for fruit flies, and 2, nematodes. That treatment adds cost to our producers. Fortunately, basil is not one of them, I guess. Rum won't be one of them as well. But for the majority of fruits that we export to the mainland, it's subject to treatment. Even sweet potatoes. And when it comes to the treatment, we have only 2 facilities. So we come back to this issue of small market, monopoly, oligopoly structure.
Hi, I have a question about City Council Bill 10, since we were talking about that in the last panel. You kind of touched on it a little bit, and I actually did see you testify at the City Council meeting the other day. But can you talk about, what role, agritourism plays into, making a profit and keeping these farms open, and also, how that bill could potentially affect that, as well as, with the events and all of that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Bill 10 is a modification to the land use ordinance by Department of Planning and Permitting. A lot of good things in there. It's a very broad bill. However, one directly one of the direct implications to our business was the agritourism portion and the limitation of certain asset use. Agritourism in general, again, is just, in my opinion, another way for farmers to have that bottom line that we've been spending a lot of time talking about. I think that there are people who can misuse that concept and kind of put it too far on the tourism end and not so much on the agritourism end. And so I do understand the need and the desire for that type of differentiation. However, broad stroke legislation like that, I personally felt was too prohibitive. And I think that there's a point to that, which is we shouldn't prohibit a food producer's ability to improve their bottom line responsibly. Second thing, and I didn't get a chance to say in the hearing, they only give you like a minute, it's pretty stressful, but is that, we have a lot of talk today about travel pono, about making a better traveler, about taking tourism and having our visitors come away with feeling how special Hawaii is, just like the residents do. There's a lot of community talk about that. What better way than agriculture to give them that sensory experience that combines nature, natural resource management, food production, as well as helping that farmer? Because they have that direct line to be able to have that visitor walk away with realizing how special this place is, just like we do. And so I think that it's really kind of a double combination. And clearly I work within the industry, so I'm a big proponent, but I just think that that's two things that are really important.
Yeah, I haven't read the bill, so I won't comment on it because that's, silly. However, I support him.
Please.
Yep, thanks very much. Doug Adams, County of Hawaii. A couple things. One, I just want to thank the HEA for including agriculture as a part of this forum. Typically, we wouldn't necessarily see economists talking about farming, and I think that it talks to the nature of talking about supply side. So thank you for that. So my department also has agricultural specialists. It's one of the things that I would love to have been able to say that we were one of the 21 Build Back Better Regional Challenge recipients, but we weren't, right? We were just one of the 60. So, but what that means is we did come up with a plan that included not just the value chain system development, but also market system development and workforce development. And those pillars are going to continue to be the things that we're going to look at as ways forward on our island when we're talking about food system. And I think it's right. I think it is food security. It's also premium branding and figuring out how those things we need for those things to integrate in even when it looks like they don't, right? And so to listen to, I'm going to push back slightly, just because I can, I guess, on the idea that we have to do everything in an industrial way. We have a tradition, at least on our island, of not doing that, right? And so we're going to lean into the fact that we have more farmers than anybody else. We have people that want to be farmers. Part of our issue has to do with how do you do the aggregation? Absolutely right, right? Part of the program is the ability to collaborate, the development of that collaboration, the development of a coalition that actually does that. We are underway, and I think that the pandemic work in food security actually helped with that, right? So I think that there are opportunities to do that. So now my question. So thank you for that. The question really is, we've heard, Colin ask you, how can the folks here help? And you kind of talked about, well, talk to your networks and talk to your legislators. So from a county perspective, how can we help, right? Because we're at the local level, and it's always helpful for us to understand both producers as well as the rest of that value chain, to understand our connections with that whole set and our ability to be present and to be partner with those folks. So I would leave you with that. Thank you.
So I'd say from a county level, the space that I see that would be really fantastic is in sort of like workforce development and pushing forward from there. And I don't just mean in the particular workforces, in adjacent areas as well. So for us, there's a lot of difficulties in fixing things, whether it's a John Deere combine or something like mechanical issues, CDL, like there's a lot of space that's farm adjacent, especially in the value add thing, that I think there could be a ton of workforce development. And it's going to do two things, right? It's going to build our community to have more talented workers and allowing people to level up. We talk about it with our farm all the time. We're always working to push them up. Sometimes they don't want that, right? They want to stay traditional. They don't necessarily want something new. So
I thought you brought up a lot of very good points when you first came up. And I think that personally, you touched on both of them, which would be my answer, which is the aggregation portion. And I think kind of what you're kind of resting on is also the aggregation portion, even when it comes to capital, even when it comes to resource. Because I think at the county level, you're the ones that are actually in the geographic location and you're the ones that have all those connections. I know at a state level, it just gets confusing. Whereas at a county level, you know your island, you know who it is, you know everything like that. So I personally feel that that intro you gave prior to the question was actually a really good answer. This is from that perspective, yeah.
For sure.
I may be biased. I come from the data collection area. I think Dr. Carl Bonham mentioned that you can only manage what you can measure. And certainly when it comes to stats and data collection, it's really lacking at the county level. We are aware of it. We're trying to maintain at the state level and then try and break it down to the county as best as we can. I think that if the state can partner with the counties to come out with the data at the county level, that'd be great. The Big Island, I mean, you have so many different things that going for you. Talk about coffee. You have the premium Kona coffee. Ka'u is pretty good as well. And then you have Hamakua. And then you have the magnuts and different types of taros, breadfruit, and the list goes on and on.
We won't forget our ulu either.
Right, the list goes on and on. USDA NAS is challenged. I mean, we used to have a team of 16 people in Honolulu. We're down to 2. Since 2013, I mean, there's been a reorg at the USDA NAS level. And Hawaii used to have its own field office. Now it's incorporated with California and Nevada. So California is the top state for egg production. And you can expect that a lot more resources are devoted to California. And Hawaii, we are ranking 46, so. Sorry.
Yep.
State warning point. So coming back to that, if we can join forces to have your department help us in some of those county collection of data, they'll be very helpful. Agriculture, like I said earlier, it's a risky business. Every time there's an earthquake, they're going to have major impacts on your economy. And the Big Island, it's not only hurricane. 2018, I lived through that because I was the IMA rep for Department of Agriculture. We started off that year with lots of rain, flooding on Oahu and Kauai. Then we have the volcanic eruption, and followed by a string of hurricanes, which were not coming from east or the south. It was coming from the east and was going to go across the state. We have never seen that ever before. With climate change, I think we will see more of that, and we actually have to prepare for that. The other thing that is really lacking in agriculture, I feel, is that we have only 4% of our farmlands that is irrigated. Water is a big issue. We talk about contiguous ag land. So on Oahu, on Maui, we have irrigated contiguous ag lands. You folks on a big island, you do have some irrigation system, but a lot of the farmers are actually dependent on rainwater. So sometimes the rainwater from hurricanes is actually good for farming, but the flooding is where it's destructive. So coming back to that, if we can get together and share some data collection, then we would have better data and better decision making for all to share.
Thanks. If I could just follow up briefly. So one, we are working with Dr. Tian's group in that regard, in terms of data, and ag data has been a big piece of this. And I'm just going to throw this out. We really would, if there's support that needs to be done, it's actually to give some money back to DOA so they can hire some of their data analysts and data collecting data scientist folks. We lost those guys in 2008 to 2010, and they have not been replaced, despite the fact that our economy did this up until 2020. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Matthew, Taylor, and Kyle, for joining us on this panel.